Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome Thomas van der Oh, co-founder and CEO Vay. Thomas, welcome to the podcast.
I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here because teleops will play a large role in the future of autonomy. You have a lot of experience in teleops coming from your days at Zoox. Now you're based in the EU in Berlin, Germany. And I'm really curious, Thomas, what is the current state of autonomy in Europe?
That's a great question to kick this off. I think you have to separate a little bit what autonomy means. You just explained to me that you have a very great and interested audience that knows the difference between level 2 and level 3 and 4 and so forth. So I think it's very important to differentiate between the different levels. And if you look at level 2 and level 3, so I would say one of the approaches to full autonomous driving, which is going incremental from ADAS systems then to full autonomy, we have some really good and decent players here in Europe. Obviously, the OEMs. Mercedes just launched the first ever level 3 system on highways at limited speeds and limited ODD and etc. But definitely, I think a really good step forward. And you have Mobileye and other OEMs that are really pushing forward on that path towards autonomous driving. On the other hand, full autonomy, I believe taking the step from level 2, level 3, then to level 4 is a massive step. And I think that's where a lot of industry experts would agree with me. That's just a big step. And there, I really have the feeling that we're really lagging behind, which is a bit unfortunate because I don't think many people, or the public at least in Europe, understands that we're, in my personal opinion, massively behind over the US and China. We don't really have, a robotaxi company. We had some good initiatives with Argo and AID, which was a subsidiary of Volkswagen and then merged with Argo, but now that got shut down. And, apart from that, from my perspective, we're really, really lagging behind, which is very concerning, in my opinion, for the European continent and for us as European citizens, where a lot of our wealth is dependent on the automotive industry. I really hope that we will continue to push forward out of Europe more, right, and build new models. And you can see that with different startups. You can also see that with, our new approach, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second, which is remotely driving or teledriving, first approach to autonomous driving. And you have other startups, not that many, unfortunately, and not, fully going after robotaxis, but a few others here and that are pushing forward. For example, Wave or Einride or Oxbotica, that are similarly like us, raised over $100 million, so are well positioned, but are not the typical, let's say, robotaxi companies that you can think about, like the likes that you have in the US or China, such as Zoox, you mentioned that, or Cruise or Waymo.
But if you look at the EU, yes, are you behind on SAE Level 4 robotaxi deployment? Yes, there's no debate on that. But what you're ahead on, which in my opinion, I don't live in the EU, but if I did, I'd be very proud on. You're ahead on SAE Level 3. Mercedes has the Drive Pilot, which is doing extremely well. You have the Porsche Mobileye announcement that came out. All signals point, if you look at the market economics and you look at consumer demand, to personally owned autonomous vehicles. The EU's leading on that. You have two leading German brands in Porsche and Mercedes-Benz. They're going to usher in personally owned autonomous vehicles. That becomes a very big market. What are your thoughts on that market? And when we do get to that market, Vay, as your teleoperations, you could play a very interesting role there if the vehicle gets into a situation that they need to be taken over.
Absolutely correct, yes. If you think about level 4, right, we often think about robotaxis, meaning urban-focused areas. I believe it's also very difficult to achieve, obviously, but what you see level 2 and level 3 companies focus on is highway driving, right, with a sensor set that can be eventually still sold to customers and doesn't cost tens of thousands or over $100,000 because it's 360-degree LiDARs and a high-performance compute, etc. So you could potentially see that these companies advance, on highways, and that would be fantastic, right, because a lot of our driving is on highways. If you think about long-distance travel, I can see that these companies advance there. You already have benefits to the customer when you have level 3, so you can do other things for a few seconds at least in parallel, and then potentially solve highway driving with a lot of question marks still, but I feel with the current sensor set, that's something that could be solved in the upcoming years. Doing that on urban streets. And this is where, exactly to your point, it could be a really, really nice complement with our remote driving technology, where we are focused on urban driving. So this combination of highway driving and assisted, or then in level 3 or level 4 fashion, and then urban driving through teledriving, could be a really, really strong combination to then, in the end, for the customer, just sitting in the back and not touching the steering wheel at all, going from downtown Munich or downtown Stuttgart to downtown Berlin, right? I do agree that this combination of highway driving assisted or level 3, level 4, and then remote driving with this basically same similar sensor set, very inexpensive, camera-based, could be a very strong combination over the years to come.
Light sensor kits are scalable. The current stack, the way it's developed, is not very scalable just based on pure economics. And if you look at Porsche, it's no longer the company of 911. I know that the ticker on the Euronext is P911, but it's the company of the Cayenne. It's the company of the Macan. That's what's selling, and that's what's generating a lot of that revenue and their profits for it. And that opens up to a whole new customer where I think at some point Porsche will do an autonomous vehicle, but there will be situations where that vehicle will need assistance from teleops. And Vay, you're taking a tele-drive first approach to autonomous driving. Why are you taking that? I see a lot of overlap with the European market and your scalability, but why are you taking that approach to autonomous driving?
So my background is in full autonomous driving. So I spent 6 years in the Valley building self-driving cars at Zoox, which was a fantastic experience and taught me a lot of things, how to think big and ambitious and, building an amazing team, all of the things, that helped me build Vay. If you look at autonomous driving, it always felt that it's always 3 years away, right? So, it's always 3 years, and then we will have them in large cities and everywhere available. But this is, something that I do not want to bank on only, right? And that's why we say it's a different approach to autonomous driving. By the way, I'm not the person who says autonomous driving is like they do everything wrong and it's impossible to scale it and it's just going to be too expensive operational wise. The matter of the fact, I think the industry, and I obviously have various connections and have so many colleagues and talk to a lot of people at all the level 4 companies in the Valley, is that we don't know at the point. And that's very, very exciting, at least for companies like ours or other companies trying to invent new things. And the big advantage of teledriving is that we believe we can get something into the market much, much earlier, right? And that is then able to scale because it uses kind of commodity hardware, right? And it is trusted, right? Trusted by the public and by the authorities in particular, because a human is always in the loop. We don't need to drive millions and millions of kilometers trying to find every little edge case that, the computer might have not seen before, because we don't have to prove that, right? In our case, there's always, in a one-to-one relation, a human who has the same steering wheel, braking, and the gas pedal. Person has view around via cameras to see the surroundings of the vehicles, to then make decisions that the person or the human might have never seen before. And that just allows to then get something into the market earlier and then also in a very trusted way.
What were those conversations like with the EU regulators when you went in there and said, we're going to do tele operations? Was there confusion? Was there a lot of education that you had to do? What were those conversations like?
So maybe it makes sense to spend a few seconds to explaining the differences in teleoperation itself. So we already touched on different levels of autonomy, right? And now it's very interesting if you think about teleoperations. There's also different ways how you can do that, right? There is teleoperations / remote assistance, sometimes people call that, which is what a lot of level 4 robotaxi companies use. You can think of it as can be on the touchpad even, right? Or it can be, at a certain screen where a robotaxi gets stuck and doesn't know what to do. So in that case, the vehicle itself actually suggests different maneuvers, how to get out of this part. For example, there's a double park vehicle in my lane and I have to get into the opposite lane and cross a solid line in the middle, right? So you have to cross some traffic rules, right? Or override some traffic rules. And in this case, the vehicle suggests this path and a human says, okay, well, out of these 5, I take this, or I slowly add additional trajectories and then I hit go, right? And then this gets transferred and the vehicle executes this path that has the advantage of not being time critical, if you will. So, right? So the requirements to do that on the network side in general, on the latency of that stack it's much less reduced, because you look at it and then you say go and then the vehicle executes whatever trajectory the human confirmed basically in the end. Now that works for very limited cases. Obviously that doesn't work over longer distances of going through San Francisco, right? And that also doesn't work at different speeds. It's usually at standstill. And then once you get out of the sensor range again, you have to redraw or do things at low speeds. That's not what we do. So this is teleoperations. We actually do what we call teledriving, right? It's a one-to-one relation from a driver to a vehicle who in real time, has a steering wheel and gas and pedal and has 3 screens in front of him or her and drives the vehicle just as well as a normal driver in the vehicle would do. And that helped a lot on regulatory side to your question, right? Because many concepts that are challenging with autonomous driving, liability of the car, insurance questions in Europe, or according to the Vienna Convention, where most countries, the US not, but most countries comply to, have to have a driver, right? Someone who makes the decisions, that also a remote driver can comply to this. And hence there's much more trust and openness towards a technology like this. At least that was our experience that we've seen here with many state regulatory bodies, but also on state and even international level.
From a technical perspective, how are you achieving tele-driving? What did you build to achieve this?
Yeah, what makes sense is just to spend a few minutes on what we want to do with this technology, because it can be extremely exciting technology that can really put upside down so many different markets. It's not autonomous driving, it's remote driving, right? It's something completely independent. That's very important to understand, right? Can basically turn upside down so many business models. The one that we're going after, what we stand for or what we want to achieve is solve transportation in metropolitan areas. So we want to make cities much more sustainable and livable. And we want to build cities basically for us humans and not for parked cars or cars stuck in traffic jams. So what we want to do now with this technology as a first step is to put out a new mobility service, which also doesn't exist. So it's a complete new, unique service that works like this. You download, for example, the Vay app. Let's say you're at the airport, you click a button, and then an electric vehicle gets remotely driven to you. And then you get inside and you drive it yourself, right? So the customer drives him or herself to the exact destination, let's say in front of the hotel, in front of your own apartment, in front of your bar, wherever you want to go. And then you just get out. And then another teledriver comes back and drives that car to the next customer. So it's sustainable, it's electric vehicles, but in particular a door-to-door mobility service at a price point that can be much cheaper than current best alternatives, which, for example, is ride-hailing or taxis, because we don't have to pay a driver in the middle because the customer drives him or herself. And also the price point will be, if they are robo-taxis, obviously it would also be cheaper than robo-taxis because they will likely be priced in a similar realm as ride-hailing. So that's what we want to do, that we're extremely excited to start rolling out. We had a massive milestone last quarter here in Europe where we put the first ever car on public European streets with no one inside. So nobody has achieved that here in Europe. And we were able to show that from regulatory and technology side. And we're now in a phase to commercialize this and get this out into the world. And so that's our use case. The other very interesting use case that you talked about, also in combination with OEMs. So we are in discussions with various OEMs to not only work on the mobility service together, which has all these benefits for the cities and the customers, as well as for a potential building a very, very large business, but also to have other services down the line. And that's the one that you probably also referred to, is you can combine this with level 3 driving, maybe on highways, right? And then you do remote driving, teledriving then in urban areas where we are focused on with our technology. And you could potentially also do very, very exciting other things, right? Which is, think about a Tele-Valet service in your private car at the click of a button. Very, very exciting. Not only in parking garages, but everywhere downtown areas, right? So you could have your personal car, you drive to maybe a friend's birthday party. You don't need to park the car because a remote driver does it. Maybe you have a glass of wine and then you would get a telechauffeur, right? Another person who actually teledrives you back all the way to your house. And then, you go to bed and the next day your car is standing in front of your house, and all at very, very reasonable prices. So these are the types of things that you can do with teledriving. That's why I'm saying now, having built this core technology, we're in the midst of commercializing this with our mobility service, but also look at into all these other very exciting businesses that we can now address. By the way, I could potentially also go on with other use cases. There's trucking, which is extremely exciting. There's a food and parcel delivery. It's just a very, very exciting industry that can be shaped because we have teledriving or remote driving.
You have multiple paths to commercialization. I'm really curious. You go out to dinner in a restaurant, you go with your wife, and you have a bottle of wine. You say, I don't want to drive, and your teleop drives you home. I love that idea. We got to figure out the regulatory framework around that, where you're not technically driving the vehicle, it's being teleop. If we can figure out the regulatory aspect of that, you're going to have a lot of opportunities there, and it's great because the Mothers Against Drunk Driving should get behind it because you're going to eliminate drunk driving. So I really like it on that. Another thing that I picked up on, the door-to-door mobility service is very interesting. Here in the United States, our airports are an absolute disaster. Europe, you have really well-functioning airports. Asia has it extremely well, so does the UAE. These great politicians decide to put the car rental centers miles away, or the Uber pickups, you got to walk for a mile to get there. But in the future, with your technology, I could open the Vay app, say, okay, I'm at door 2, have the vehicle drive up remotely. I get in, take over, and go on my journey, and then say in 2 days, I go back to the airport, drop it off, and then you take it back to park. Is that an example of where this technology can go? Because if it does, you're going to save me a lot of time and a lot of headaches.
Yes, absolutely. Right. So this is something that's definitely a very exciting application where you think about a optimized car rental experience, which I know, by the way, it's not only in the US, also, here in Europe. Thanks, though, for mentioning that it's maybe not as far walking to the different parts, but it's also, not the best user experience, but, another use case that you can imagine doing, right? Whether you're at the airport or whether you're anywhere in the city. Now we have this mindset that you have to have a physical car rental somewhere sitting that has to be connected, but many, many cars enabled through teledriving in the beginning, probably through car rental agencies or an umbrella, right? But down the line, hopefully that now we're going really very far out. But I would love, right, that all the cars, maybe not all the cars, but electric cars over the next, many years to come are going to be teledrive or remotely drive enabled, right? And that just opens up so many things. Think about if you want to share a car with your friends, right? Or your family or with your grandparents, or you have another friend. Not everyone needs to have, his or her own car. Actually, another very interesting part is, which I don't know if you know, I was certainly surprised when I saw the fact that we never had so many cars ever, right? In Europe, in Berlin, we have the highest number of private vehicles owned ever. You always think we get better in these things, but no, it's not only in Berlin, it's in all European cities. People start buying second cars, right? Why is that? Why could you not potentially share one? Or maybe you drive one way yourself and then you have a remote driver drive it back so your partner can use it. These are, I think, all things that you can do with remote driving technology, that can really change how we live in cities. And that's why I believe it makes it so exciting now, having built now over all these years. By the way, we've been now working for over 4 years on this to build an automotive grade stack. It was quick to do a prototype with safety driver on public streets, but then really building this to the highest functional safety requirements and cybersecurity requirements, and building our own automotive grade stack, ASIL-D and so forth, was quite an endeavor. So really excited that we've crossed this off and now can start working on the commercialization of this great technology.
When you look at the second car in a household, it's driven by one thing and one thing only: convenience. I want to go where I want, when I want. I don't want to have to wait. Your technology could potentially solve that convenience issue. Where I live, it could take you 15 minutes to get an Uber, and it's highly inconvenient. And then the team at Uber decides to raise the price because there's not very much demand and they have to drive far to get there. But your thing would solve that. So that's why you have to have a second car, because you need the convenience. You're building the technology. You've been building it for 4 years. Today, you're operating in Berlin with no human in the vehicle. Are there limitations to the routes that you can operate your vehicles today?
Yeah. So we are headquartered here in Berlin. We actually took out the safety driver for the first time in Hamburg, not in Berlin. So we also have offices and operations in Hamburg. We've been teledriving with safety driver now for over 3.5 years in Berlin and Hamburg in all areas, right? That's the current state. And if we look at it, at the operational design domain, so we take it step by step, we can take out the safety driver in a specific area in Hamburg that has all the very difficult maneuvers that I know are hard to do for robotaxis, crosswalks, unprotected left turns, double parked vehicles. I just, saw just today again, very interesting bicyclist behavior on our roads, and obviously pedestrians. So this is where we can operate today. We are urban focused, right? So we don't teledrive on highways at this point. when we select an ODD, obviously multiple things come together. The first often is, why do we do this from a business perspective, right? What's the goal for that? And then we have just a very sophisticated process that looks at different parts. Connectivity is obviously a big one. How good is the coverage in this area? And then we have different safety assessments that look at, okay, what are potential safety risks on this route? And how do we ensure that the teledrivers are properly trained, which is, by the way, a very big part of our endeavor. Often you think, okay, it's all about technology, but actually a lot of the things that we learned, and we have over, I think, 20 certified teledrivers that went through theory training, practical training, follow very sophisticated driving guidelines, which we call anticipatory and defensive, right, to really become the best driver on the road so that they're familiar with the ODD. And then once all these checks are crossed, we're ready to go.
How important is latency as you're building out the ODD and scaling the ODD?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and it's obviously one that we get very often, and it's kind of the core of what we do, which is having very reliable and low latency streaming technology. That's been a big focus of the development over the years. If you think about latency, it's very important that you kind of put them a little bit into perspective, meaning that, if you blink of an eye, it's 250 milliseconds. So it's very, and you do this all the time. If you look at around the main reasons for fatal accidents, it's often distraction. So if you look on your phone, right, or get distracted by your passenger, like someone on the passenger, obviously there you lose focus for seconds rather than milliseconds. So for us, it's very important that we have latency measures that we put in place, measurements with which you can control the vehicle, right? That's how we defined it. Think about that we can with certain latency bands, depending on the speeds. So that adds another layer to this. It's obviously if you go 1 or 5 miles per hour, you require different latencies if you go 25 miles per hour. So depending on all these different setups, we've identified and showed through, thousands and thousands of tests that we can control the vehicle in these different latencies kind of setups. And if we're out of these bands, the vehicle would identify that smartly and basically instantly, and can then do the right behavior, which is doing a minimal risk maneuver in case there's really, a latency challenge and it's outside of our controllability latency bands.
Are you using multiple carriers? I know you have the relationship with Deutsche Telekom, then there's Orange. Are you using multiple carriers to ensure that if you're in a dead zone for, say, carrier A, the carrier B's network can step in and work there so you're never losing connectivity to the vehicle?
I mean, our entire safety concept is built on the fact that we don't need a 100% reliable network connection. It's a very important safety goal of our entire system architecture because we cannot guarantee that. It's a shared medium with the public. You cannot really guarantee that. That's why our concept is built that there can be latency outages in the system. Also, by the way, the teledrive center, the electricity can go down and our backup electricity also might also be faulty. So there's different system failures that can make the vehicle detected and make the vehicle come to a safe stop. Having said that, obviously our goal is to have the highest robustness and reliability in our network connections, and then working with carriers is a big plus. We're working on 4G, by the way, so we're using existing infrastructure that's out there. You mentioned earlier that we had a great showcase together with Deutsche Telekom and Ericsson at the Mobile World Congress, where we showed a new feature where we just drove on one modem. So we drove out of Barcelona on private grounds in Berlin, and we just drove it on one modem, and that's the technology that we showed called L4S that has the potential, as I mentioned, to drive maybe on one or maybe then on two carriers who have this technology that then enables to potentially increase the service coverage. Right now, as I mentioned, we're right now on urban environments where usually the coverage is extremely good. If you think about really rolling this out at scale, also maybe in very rural areas, you might not have all the multiple carriers available there. So then being able to just teledrive on one or two carriers can be extremely useful there too. That's kind of our relationship to carriers.
Let's just put a layman's hat on here. You're going through Spain, where Barcelona is based, and then Berlin is based in Germany, multiple countries. Does roaming play an effect in this? Did you have to get a roaming agreement to be able to remotely drive the vehicle, or what did that look like?
So very important. We don't plan to do anything across different countries or anything like that, right? We have our teledrive center in Hamburg, right? Actually in downtown Hamburg, and we have our operations in Hamburg, and we plan to keep it that way. You have to be in the same jurisdiction. The business model that I mentioned works extremely, extremely well with this setup. Why we did this now in Barcelona was simply because the Mobile World Congress happened to be there, and it turned up actually that we had to route through, I forgot the exact route, was Barcelona, London, I think then to Paris, Stockholm, Berlin, and then from Berlin to our vehicle. So it was, I think, 9,000 kilometers going both directions to then teledrive a car on one modem. So that was, I think, a very interesting demo that we showed. There was no roaming involved because we had our vehicles in Berlin where they usually are, and then talk over wireless only until the cell tower. And then everything else was through the backbone.
9,000 kilometer distance is pretty commendable. What you'd clearly demonstrated at Mobile World Congress is that the technology works, that you can go over long distances. And I'm saying that by removing regulatory, legal, because you were operating on private grounds during the test, not advocating that for public roads. But the one thing is clear from that demonstration that Vay has the ability to scale. Are you looking to expand into other EU member countries? Obviously, Germany and Hamburg and Berlin are your home bases. Are you looking to expand eventually into other EU member countries?
So right now we're really focused on Germany and actually as well as the US, which is exciting to potentially go back to where I spent a lot of time working previously. And this is our focus right now. We have talked to various other European member states, and we actually got a lot of interest from different cities, also outside of Germany. So we will definitely come up, with a roadmap, and not only to stay in Germany and Europe, but right now our focus is really Germany and in parallel the US.
Okay, so you're going to expand. I'm very happy in the U.S., and hopefully you make your way down here to Florida. We love innovation. We love mobility companies, especially autonomy companies. As you expand to new countries, new states, there's going to be different legal and regulatory environments. What has to be done from a legal, regulatory, and technical perspective to ensure smooth operations as you expand into new cities, new states, and new countries, and hopefully eventually the United States? We'd love to welcome you back.
Yeah, I'd love to come, by the way, to Florida. We actually looked into this in depth. There is a little of a challenge in your current AV law that you put in place, which I know that you put in place for very positive reasons to get robotaxis. Unfortunately, that puts a bit of a challenge into, going right now with the current regulation to Florida, or it added a bit of risk to our rollout. So that's why we won't be in Florida this year. If you have good connections there, feel free we can chat about this after this podcast to change a few things in Florida. It's a minor thing, and then once we have that, I'd love to come to Florida. Miami and that other parts are, I think, very great launch cities and very innovative public there. That's Florida. The other areas in the US, other states also, very open, and we feel like that we can, not only come there to launch, but also to scale. That's very important to us, right? And that's where we get a lot of support from different states and feel very good about also coming to the US.
We have a few friends, and so Florida would love to welcome your technology, and we'll leave it at that. But from a financial perspective, what you're working on in tele-driving, the market that you're in, that I consider tele-operations, it's healthy. Startups in the sector are raising capital. I repeat, startups in the tele-operation, they're raising capital, and they're raising significant amounts of capital. It's not just from the United States, it's also from European investors as well, and some from the APAC region. As new tele-operation companies come online, what's going to be your unique competitive advantage? What's going to distinguish Vay in the market from these new emerging companies that are coming along in your sector?
Yeah, I feel very good about the current position that we built when it comes to the technology and technology maturity. As I think we all know, it's extremely difficult to get from a prototype stage into a stage where you can take out the safety driver, right? And we're really focused on public streets without safety drivers. So that's something that I believe we have a very, very strong position on, basically urban public driving at speeds that are not walking speeds. That's where I believe we're in a really strong position right now. It's very important that tele-driving, we all are very prudent in the sense that it's an emerging industry. It's a massive, massive industry, right? So there's going to be so much business to be shared, as I mentioned, across all these different companies. So I very, very much encourage different, companies coming together, working together on explaining, like what was also one of the reasons why I'm on this podcast, to educate the public about the societal benefits of teledriving and the big advantages when it comes to safety, potentially in the transportation system, and getting something out with benefits to the society, and working together on creating this industry, right? Because it's nascent. And if we're not prudent, if we feel rushed or we have to be quicker than A or B or C or D. That's not how I see that, because it's really an industry that we all are shaping right now that can have so much positive impact on us. And we want to create this industry together. That's where I don't see or are so much concerned about kind of competition coming in that space. We have a very clear path that we want to execute that we believe is very lucrative, for investors, mostly for the employees and the cities, as well as then potential large OEM partners and others. And we're just going to go and continue executing and doing one step after the other, while being in close contact with similar companies to ensure that we create the right regulatory frameworks, that we all think about safety from the get-go and, don't do anything to cut off anyone else. Because that's, I believe, one of the biggest threats that I see right now, that any of us in the field can do something, too fast or too dangerous that can really put a risk to this emerging industry.
This industry is emerging. Nobody can take corners. Nobody can cut corners. Your home at Zoox was very proud of not cutting corners and putting safety first. What Dr. Rosekind built there from the safety culture. The same thing has to happen to the tele operations, tele-driving, where safety has to be first in the culture and can't cut corners. Well, the safety is paramount of the industry to ensure smooth operations and to ensure public trust and also trust with the regulators. Different companies are trying different segments of the market. You're focused on the urban mobility, and your use case, I think, is a very big market. Then there's the Israeli teleoperation startup Autonomy that's focused on public transportation market. Is that a sustainable long-term market? Because when I look into the economics of public transportation, the MTA's numbers are very bad. They're bleeding billions of dollars a year. They're trying to pass a tax now in New York to subsidize it. And then meanwhile, you have Governor Murphy in New Jersey said, don't pay the tax, come here. So is going into this public transportation market for a teleoperator, is that even sustainable long-term market?
I think it really depends. It comes back to the question. I started to talk about some of the use cases, when we started this podcast, for OEM partners and for our mobility service, trucking and others. There's many others, right? You mentioned public transport. Also, some of these companies look, for example, sideboard robots is another very interesting example where you can use teleoperations to guide sideboard robots who do parcel deliveries or food deliveries. A public transport where you as a B2B partner come in and help solve edge cases potentially, similar to robotaxis, where there's companies who can provide, the types of services on remote assistance that I was explaining earlier. For me, for sure, that makes sense to have, a centralized player there in this field. The question is, how big is that industry right now? How big will this really be in 3-4 years, depending on where autonomy is going, right? It might still be a very, very small industry. And then the question is whether the people who are in there, do they want to outsource that or not? I think there's very different kind of handles to enter this market, right? You could also start on private grounds, for example, right? And build big use cases there. You can do things on warehouses. You can do movement of things on harbors and things like that, right? All these are very relevant, good entry points and are in of itself, very lucrative and large enough markets to just be in there, in my opinion, right? As a startup, we chose something very, very ambitious and very, very complex. Doing something on public streets in urban areas, obviously, is not as complex as autonomous driving. We were able, and fortunate that we raised so much capital, over $100 million, and built I love my team. And it's very great to see all these different experts from the automotive industry, then many from the Silicon Valley coming back, joining forces, right, to put this on public streets. So it's very ambitious. It's not as complex and definitely doesn't need as much capital as robotaxis, but you could also slice the cat a bit different and just say, okay, I'm just going to do very smaller private use cases on private grounds. That's the road we chose. I feel very good and very, very excited about, what we can do now as a next step, but different. That is saying different paths lead to Rome is also saying in English, I guess, right?
It's an ambitious path. Zoox chose the ambitious path with Jesse and Tim from day one. You have to go ambitious. You have to go big or go home, and you're clearly going big. On the size aspect, I'm really curious, are there limits to the vehicle size that tele-driving could operate on public roads where you say, hey, let's not go bigger than a passenger van or not go bigger than this? Is there technical limitations or just overall safety things where you're just not comfortable going at a certain vehicle size?
Even though I think we're extremely ambitious, it's very different from robotaxis in the sense that we often get described as very pragmatic, right? Because we built tele-driving in urban areas. We launched something in this use case that is, very tangible, has clear advantages over everything that's out there. And then we do step by step, right? go this without any autonomous driving. It's a very big business case and positive for the society. And then you can take and scale this all without autonomous driving, right? And then our plan, by the way, is going back to where I believe our company is based on smaller iteration steps, right? Meaning that we get something out over time. We would then do different things, potentially extending our product offerings through different items that we discussed. And that's very important is I don't see teledriving as a bridge technology for robotaxis or others, but quite the opposite, that with teledriving, it really enables a different path towards autonomy. Maybe we can also briefly chat on that because it's core to our strategy and also where I come from. That's important to keep in mind, right? Because we want to kind of not go from 0 to 99.99% fully autonomous driving, obviously, because we do teledriving, and it's a massive step and very, very ambitious. To do that, we actually kind of slice the problem down and say, hey, we just want to do teledriving first. We can take that and scale that even if there's no autonomous driving around. And then we roll out autonomous driving features as they become available. That's what we call gradual rollout of autonomous driving. We talked about a potential partnering with an OEM or others who are very strong on level 2 and level 3. You can start doing that. Imagine doing then level 3 or maybe even certain level 4 on highways. And then the rest you still do to urban driving. Maybe we can figure out also through high quality teledrive data, because we have a lot of data now. We can also develop low speed AV use cases, summon features, or, just going straight. So this is where we are also focused on, and, then add autonomy over time. And hence, I would describe our company vision very ambitious, but it's kind of a very step-by-step and iterative and kind of a pragmatic way to get into the market. That's, I believe, very important if you think about building a startup, right? From a lean startup or design thinking perspective, that you want to get something out there and then start iterating, which we're all about. To your question with respect to limitations, right, or technical limitations, we're focused on urban driving at this stage. We simply haven't focused too much on highway driving or other areas that changes the safety case that we've defined for urban driving and other parts, but I don't see anything that absolutely prevents us from also going on highways. It's simply a decision of on which parts do we focus. And I also believe that really helps with, level 2, level 3 on highways, and we are really focused on urban driving, where I believe with a sensor set of the Mercedes-Benz and Mobileye and others, they're very far away of also having this work on urban streets.
I'm really curious. Can you expand on this? You alluded to it. Why teledriving you feel is a core technology, not a stepping stone or a bridge to autonomy?
I believe teledriving itself as a technology can turn upside down all these different industries that we described in of itself, right? And that's why I believe if you think about the stepping stone, that could actually be, if you look backwards in a few years, that could be the one, okay, this really changed how we moved around and how we think about mobility. And then once we are there, I believe teledriving allows for different rollout of autonomous driving features by adding then certain, let's call it ODDs, but ODDs you can think of like certain maneuvers or certain areas like highways, or certain areas, maybe longer stretches to the airport, which is just straight. Maybe there's even a bit protected on the sides, where you can say, hey, in these areas, we feel good that we can do, level 3 or also level 4 autonomous driving. And that's where we would then launch that. And the other parts, the customer drop-off or the final stretch to, get close to the bar where there's a lot of people, right? And, figuring out how to get through crowds, all this will be done for the very, very foreseeable future still through teledriving. And this, how I see and think about, a decade of human-machine interaction, if you will. So certain things machines can already handle, the other parts would still be done by a human. And that's, I believe, the beauty of teledriving, right? Because it allows to do these things together and not just go from 0 to all, like everything is a computer. That's what I meant by a gradual rollout of autonomous driving features.
From an economic perspective, what is Vay's business model? Are you going to operate this long-term as yourself? Will you look to partner with the OEMs? Where do you see this going in the future?
Our main purpose is to get this out into the hands of customers and cities, right? Because I really want this out, and it's going to take time, right? That, that we get rid of, all these petrol cars that clog our streets, right? It's literally like this. And everyone is talking about this, but everything right now hasn't changed. So the most important for me is that I find the right setup to get this out to the public, to hopefully help, solve transportation in metropolitan areas. So if there's partners who are very well suited on the different areas, we're very, very much open to partner and collaborate on different challenges, whether it's the vehicle platform, whether it's certain things on the operational side, whether it's thinking about how can we roll this out in all cities in a few years all over the US, and someone comes around and say, I know you can put this there and we do this all together. I would be very, very open to that, because that's our biggest goal, to get this out as soon as possible. At this stage, I explained our current go-to-market and the one also that we want to scale, which is building our own mobility service, where we'd operate the fleet with Vay cars in that fleet, where you have the Vay app and you can just kind of at a click of a button get an electric car delivered that you don't have to park. so that's what we're after. And then in parallel, we can do many other things also in partnerships. Also on the autonomy side, I mentioned the parts that we're pursuing. We have a certain team in-house that is building assisted teledrive features and certain first features on a gradual rollout of autonomous driving. But that is something that, we could also see what are the right partners to really get this into the market as quickly as possible as an alternative approach to full level 4 robotaxis.
Thomas, this has been a really fascinating conversation where you shined a bright, positive light on teledriving. So thank you so much for that. And as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
I think the biggest part is that there is a technology which is called teledriving, right? Remotely driving vehicles that we've developed from a technology and safety perspective, and we could put into very good use, and that can really shape how we live in cities. It's independent of autonomous driving, right? It's a very different thing, and it can really change how we live in cities. We're very excited to see the next months and years how this new technology can really shape how we all live in cities, and even beyond that in all different mobility industries that are out there.
The bottom line is teledriving is scaling, and in Hamburger, Berlin, hopefully one day Thomas will put you in a Vay vehicle and you can experience the future of teledriving. The future is bright, the future is autonomous, the future is Vay. Thomas, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you've enjoyed listening, please kindly rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@roadtoautonomy.com. The Road to Autonomy podcast is produced by the Road to Autonomy LLC. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect those views of the Road to Autonomy, its subsidiaries, its shareholders, directors, investors, or partners. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, investment, tax, or business advice. Nothing is a recommendation that you purchase, sell, or hold any security or other investment, or that you pursue any investment style or strategy. The content of this podcast is presented on an as-is basis with no warranties, express or implied, of any kind. Financial mentions about companies in the Road to Autonomy Index and discussions about the Road to Autonomy Indexes are for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon when making any investment decision. Furthermore, an inclusion of security within the Road to Autonomy Index is not a recommendation by the Road to Autonomy Indices LLC to buy, sell, or hold that such security, nor is it considered to be investment advice.